Do you want to know what the fallen are, little one? In a sense, they are angels, but not the angels your mom imagines she prays to. Brass trumpets picnicking in the clouds. In their true essence, they are great swirling engines of wing and blood, fiery eyes that peer around the corners between worlds. Dark, radiant things conjured from fresh battlefields. A Frankenstein's Valkyrie, forever crashing to Midgard. What grief demands their hate? What vast cannibal hunger?
Welcome to the Fallen Cycle. This is a universe full of secrets, waiting for those brave or foolhardy enough to seek them out. Tales from When I Had a Face was written by James Curcio, with editing by Brian Johnson. A modern fairy tale about death, loss, and finding redemption in the strangest places, for those of us still haunted by the uncertain, occult logic of dreams. The soundtrack features the work of David Bessell, along with contributions from Jenn E, P. Emerson Williams, and James Curcio, from the archives of past Mythos projects. Support for this project is pivotal. By becoming a patron at patreon.com/mythosmedia, that's MYTHOS media, you enable us to make more content like this, and to be able to hire on more freelance artists in future works. You can also discover more about the myth-punk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com. This podcast contains adult themes and may induce psychosis. And now, this week's episode. Chapter 3. The Temple of the Sun.
The three of us sat in the cell, clothed in shadow and flickering light. Nyssa was lazily curled into a ball, and Elena pouted in the corner, trying to hide from me that she had been crying. In truth, I still had no inkling then of where we might be. We waited in silence, and I began to drift into dreamless sleep until the door was flung wide, and I was jolted awake. The women entered the room like a pack of dogs, rabid indifference in eyes dark as coal smoke. We scrambled to the far side, but it was no use. They quickly overpowered us and shackled our wrists. We were dragged into winding corridors and were soon lost in them like a tiny vessel pulled into the depths of the trackless sea. From cell to cell we went, each time hearing the hopeless shrieks of those inside as they were latched aboard, until our group had swelled to 20 or 30 that I could see. The clinking of chains and rustling of cloth and creaking of boiled leather were all I heard as we were tossed forward and up. Up we went, the chain yanking us into a run and then falling slack, leaving us listing in the darkness until the next surge carried us on. Fingers of light pierced through chinks in the gnarled roots and hollows as we proceeded, then dimmed, turning womb red like the insides of a closed eyelid. Yet even then, how could I have known our cell was in the very roots of the massive tree that grew through the Temple of the Sun? Now you see, my granddaughter, why I told you the myth of her death and resurrection, for her tomb will be transformed into this very place. As it seems to me now, our cell was just one of many that lined her deep roots, which altogether formed a buzzing hive of those dreamers, witches, lost souls, burnouts, and refugees of dying worlds who had been entrapped there, dangling between time and eternity, life and death. I would eventually come to know many things both mysterious and horrible about that place that was not a place, contained within a time that was not a time. At first I felt little need for explanation, only wanting to go on living, whatever the odds. We gathered finally before an arched doorway, fashioned of live wood, the final threshold between the bower and what lay beyond. There was a single column of us, men, women, and children, leading back down the hall into the inky recesses of this otherworldly wooden prison. The gateway opened with a lurch and a crunch, like the sound of a neck snapping out of joint after a short, speedy fall from the gallows. Our eyes stung from the midday sun. Half blind, scrambling under the arch like frightened oxen, we pressed together and made our way forward in sheer numb shock. It took several moments more before I could make sense of what I was hearing. At first, it seemed the roar of a river, but the sun on my face was dry and hot. The air was salty but smelled sweet. I could see nothing except blinding light. Just when I thought I was blind for good, my vision did return. The roar reached us from below, battering my ears and drowning all else to a dull hum. A river of people spilled from the top of the stair down to the broad plaza that vanished round the side of the temple, babbling together as one voice. And we stood on the summit at the center of it all, before the boughs of her tree, which seemed to glower down upon us as its smaller branches wriggled their way snake-like toward the boundless sky. A woman stepped from behind the base of the tree as if she too had been disgorged from its roots, and walked toward us. Then another, and another, seeming to float across the platform like a formation of geese on a pond. 7 of them appeared in all, veils covering their faces, though the limpid pools of their eyes could be seen dancing behind their masks, red hair spilling from beneath the fabric like a blood-stained waterfall. These women exuded a fervid presence, a force I'd never sensed before, a desert mirage, the strange fascination that'll ultimately lead to your death. Their threat was the threat of her invisible presence. Like stewards of an absent queen, they were said to rule in Lilith's stead. The crowd fell silent the moment they appeared, a church congregation hushed by the sudden entrance of their pastor. It was so silent, in fact, that I swore I could hear the padding of the women's bare feet on the polished stone. They stopped and turned to face the tree, their arms raised high. As if on cue, the fanatics then swiftly split the clothes from our backs with their knives and ripped the remaining rags away, leaving us naked before the crowd. Elena was the worst for it, shaking in the hot midday sun, her teeth chattering. I stared into the ravening eyes of the congregation, hollow as shotgun barrels, and saw our end in those dark double chambers. They seemed to me as beasts who had learned to go about dressed as men, restraining themselves, waiting for some final sign before they would reveal their true natures. Then the so-called sisters started to sing an eerie melody, and the congregation of her bastard children murmured along in a tuneless monotone. In the temple of the temple of the temple of the holy sits a woman who is waiting for the sun. In the temple of the temple, in the temple of the holy, creeping shadows, falling darkness, she is waiting for the sun. For the people of the people by the people making people. In the temple of the temple of the holy, she is weeping for the people of the people, making people. In the temple of the temple, in the temple of the sun. When the chant was completed, all their eyes turned toward us with singular ferocity. A gang of tomcats presented with a fresh saucer of milk. One of her children stepped forward and grabbed my arm. Another raised a glowing hot rod of iron and pressed down with impassive firmness. It happened fast. I remember the initial pain, that quick rattlesnake bite. Though it wasn't until it started to heal that the real agony came, the itching of new skin waging war with the rancid wound left behind, until all that remains is an angry red seal, the sigil of their goddess in absentia. Look here, just below my shoulder. The scar has changed with age, covered over with wrinkles now and faded. But you can still see the swirl of a serpent and its head as it bites its tail, and her eye, in the middle, closed in sleep. Ayta, you can see that this place I tell you of is as real as you live and breathe. As I recall, Elena's face was set, blank of expression, as she watched them brand me. She fidgeted in her chains and sucked on her lower lip anxiously, but showed no other outward sign of distress. Perhaps she was trying to prepare herself for her own ordeal. I clutched my arm and winced, the pain beginning to spread through my bones as I watched the same done to the girl who stood on the other side of me. She howled and shrieked and made a fuss for many minutes after, and pity made me look away, as if seeing her like this was too shameful, that she would carry the burden of my remembering long after she might have otherwise let it go. But it was Elena whose response surprised me most. Her flesh sizzled like anyone else's, but she laughed like she had just remembered an old, forgotten joke she had once shared with a confidant. And it burst forth uproariously, her head thrown back, barking laughter for several terrifying moments. I was afraid they would kill us for this outburst, but after an uncomfortable pause, they ignored her, just continuing down the line as if it had never happened, until all of us had been similarly marked. Nyssa turned toward me after they had branded 4 or 5 more and said, "The Raven Man is going to take us soon," with an eerie nonchalance. Before I could say anything, someone began hobbling up the stairs toward us. He walked unevenly on a clubbed foot, his face a mass of skin that seemed rough as rhino hide. He raised a fist toward the crowd when he reached the top step and stood on the platform along with us, and removed a wide-brimmed hat, which he placed with a strange reverence on the ground before him. Then he wiped his damp brow and smiled, though it didn't reflect in his eyes. "Traitors!" he roared, his voice a deep baritone that carried across the open space so all those clustered on the stairs could hear, and I thought he sounded quite like the mad preachers heard throughout Siberia. Then he gestured toward the lot of us, a motion that seemed unnaturally smooth for one so portly and callous. "First choice before high noon!" Now his hand swept toward the woman that stood beside me. She was tall, easily a head taller than I was, sinewy and lithe as a deer. "This one is from one of the tribes to the east." He put a hand on her shoulder. She shrank under his touch but continued to stare forward, her expression unchanging. "Not without a pleasing shape," he added, bending in to take a closer look with an exaggerated leer for the audience's benefit. The crowd responded with predictable shouts and whistles. I saw small carved blocks of wood raised above many heads, and one of them caught the preacher's eye. "Do I hear 2,000?" he asked, but the others lowered their blocks. He made a gesture, and the woman was led out of the line by one of the children, a particularly feral creature wearing nothing but a halter and cape made of chicken bones. They walked down the stairs toward the crowd, her head lowered, already knowing her fate was sealed. Elena muttered to herself in mounting desperation, and she clutched for my hand despite the chains. The preacher took another ponderous step in her direction and swept his hand out again. A terrible feeling rose in my stomach, like a wave that seemed to crest without ever breaking, as I watched the ocean of bodies swell beneath us. "And next up, I have something very special for you," he cried. "A Chernaean noble by the look of her. Why, she looks the very image of our goddess. Look at that hair, those eyes. A blood of high vintage, we can be sure. A fine offering for thirsty roots." Elena looked up at me with fluttering eyes, her mouth frozen in an O, though no sound escaped her lips. Her dramatics seemed to rouse the crowd further, and they thrust their blocks into the air, clapping their hands together, pushing and shoving. They rarely had a shot at a noble woman, much less one so beautiful, and just shy of marrying age. Surely this would put off her wrath for another week. The preacher patted his hands together unctuously and let the mob work themselves into a frenzy for a pregnant moment before terminating it with a loud stamp of his foot. "We'll start at 15,000, he said, his back to the crowd. Then he peered over his shoulder at them and grinned, revealing a mouth full of gold teeth. The crowd fell silent, but now it held an air of discomfort and confusion. Eyes darted to and fro. Only the richest merchants could start bidding at such a price. Then they cast sideways glances at Elena. Many of these turned sour, and with shaking heads or averted gazes, the bidders waited to try for a sacrificial offering that was less expensive, no matter how happy this one might have made the sisters. A man emerged from the slowly shrinking mob then, walking in a straight line toward the preacher with single purpose. Layers of patterned fabric protected him from the brilliant sunlight, albeit dappled with holes worn by long travel. Under those robes rattled bones, gems, and stranger things. A cowl blocked off most of his face, but I noticed him amongst the others right away. I would later learn he had been thought long gone, but he seemed already like an apparition who wandered here from a world beyond. Even then, I knew an Oyun when I saw one, no matter the garb or how unlike our own their songs were. He raised a wooden block over his head and let out a shrill whistle. The preacher waved in his direction, and one of Lilith's children clasped Elena by the wrists. She pleaded to me, once again finding her voice, though the words were almost indistinguishable. I had an immediate, pathetic desire to help the poor girl, but of course I was as helpless and out of my element as she was. The cowled man seemed to hesitate, looking us over one at a time, again and again. Then he nodded to himself. "I'll take the 3 of them," he said softly. I could hear it over the roar of the crowd, although I'm not quite sure how. The preacher narrowed his eyes. "For the same rate?" "Fine," he muttered, already turning to walk down the stairs, still talking as he strode on. "If the portents hold true, who will still live on the morrow to collect the bill?" After the transaction was made, new notches carved into the stick he bore. The traveler gestured toward the stairs, intending we walk ahead of him, but Elena was frozen in place, trying to cross her legs and cover her bare chest with shackled hands. She looked at me, her cheeks pale as bone. "Sir," I said, "I recognize you are a tale-teller." He squinted at me. "I do not tell their tales. The spirits never cease their talking. I merely write down their words from time to time. I am a scribe, you might say, an observer of human folly." I stepped in front of him, forcing a smile. "What I meant is, I can't imagine you would force us to go about in public like this." A sheepish grin worked its way across the weathered face I could see under his cowl. "Oh, you're right. I'm not altogether used to wearing one of these. So many different, parts," he said, as if I had caught him in some game that I didn't know we were playing. He looked down at himself and wiggled his fingers before his face. He rummaged through his pack and produced 2 sets of tattered robes, which he handed to the others. But when my turn came, he shrugged his top cloak off and held it out, peering at me intensely. "You saw what I am, at least in part. So you may wear my outer traveling clothes. You needn't make that face, they do not smell. I do not sweat, as you do." He wore what I immediately recognized as sacred raiment under his cloaks. The leather was covered with intricate beadwork, which must have been a stunning sight at one time. Now it too was faded and patched in places with strips of much cheaper cloth. His shoulders were adorned with raven's feathers, though many had since fallen off. Now that we were more or less properly attired, the 3 of us followed him down the broad stairs that wrapped around the outside of the temple. Round we went, ever descending in silence. Fear tugged at Elena's features, giving her a sharp, drawn look, her eyes never wavering for long from the man who had purchased us. But Nyssa seemed unconcerned, nearly skipping as she walked, her chains jingling like bells. The demeanor of the city around us changed the instant we passed through a gatehouse beyond the final landing. The Temple of the Sun was pristine, radiating the sublime inhumanity of transcendent geometry. Once through the gate and into the outer city, we found ourselves in an utter knotwork of manifest, coarse humanity. We wandered a maze of narrow streets, orange and indigo mosaics adorning the walls of adobe buildings, stacked one atop another in all directions. The assemblage of architecture only broken up by the flow of roots that burst from the ground here and there. Women and children ran between doorways, neighbors loudly carousing. We heard the clack-clack of games as bone dice hit the board, the whistle of steam as a pot was pulled off a roaring stove, roosters crowing in the distance. In the noontime sun, nothing seemed to cast a shadow. Yet all of it was somehow unnatural as well, like a smile that's held uncomfortably long, and the people all seemed to carry a fatigue they could only partially hide. In New Babylon, the party could never end. "The others, what will happen to them?" I asked the man. I could not make out his face beneath the shadows of his hood, but he seemed an old wanderer, worn weary through years on the road. "Those sold will be offered after a month of service," he said. "On the moon following the sale, they will be given to the 7 sisters for the rite." Offered, as in sacrificed, I cut in. You mean, their blood will feed that withered old tree, he said. Splendid, I said, raising an eyebrow at him. I hoped he would break into a smile, but he did not, only looking impassively forward as he walked. We passed a group of gap-toothed people with wicked grins, betting on 2 fighting lizards, each the size of my thigh. Elena stopped, peering over her shoulder at the spectacle as the beasts hissed and slowly stalked one another in a circle until one struck with a sickening crunch and the other flopped about the board, trying in vain to regain purchase. Elena looked away in the final instant. I imagined she preferred not to know where her food came from. So, we have a month to live, I said. It is a peculiar system of governance, I admit, although the locals will insist that it has always worked for them. We'll talk more in private, the man replied, suddenly with more urgency in his voice. He was scanning the faces of all who came into his line of view like a bird on the hunt, and his pace quickened as well. He grabbed hold of Elena's hand so he could induce her to walk faster with him. Now follow me. Will you please? She pulled away and spun around on him. You listen to me, whoever you are. I'm Elena, daughter of Karl Kurlstier, Chernayan Minister of Science. I order you to— Yes, I know who you are, he said impatiently. Then my father— He looked around, hoping no one had heard their exchange. Your father knows where you are too. She tilted her head to the side at this, as she weighed his words. Then she frowned, not able to bear this information any further down track, and she spoke no more as the Oyon urged us forward. What could we do but follow this man? He had us in irons. But he was also a puzzle to me. He afforded what seemed to be a high price, and yet he went about in rags. Did I catch the glint of well-earned wisdom in his eyes? Maybe. But mightn't it have been excitement at the pretty young things he'd just acquired? We see what we are conditioned to see.
At this point in her tale, Gran held her good eye open wide, stretching the skin with her fingers until her eyeball seemed like it was a pearl revealed from the pink oyster shell of her skull. Seeing. That's what it's really about, she said, though I didn't yet see that this was no man who stood before me. Not at all. She continued. I want you to remember this, granddaughter. Places have a way of thinking, a way of being. Everything is still alive in the circle of wood before it is committed to ash. Consider what mysteries the outer city must have held in its tightly packed corridors, in the labyrinth of roots and stones that lay beyond the bronze gates. Whole lives must have played out in those alleys, worn down by 1,000 seasons of padding feet. In the end, all I got was a quick glance as we hurried on. Traveling in her lands was to always be watched, though one can never look her eye to eye. Do you catch my meaning? When she finally returned, New Babylon itself would be her face, her glass-lidded eyes, her ivory teeth, the bazaar, her smile, the sunset, her hair. Gran's smirk broke the side of her face further, lips and cheek drawn into a mass of scars and wrinkles. We dreamed her, and so she dreamed us. Young Ayta looked off and tried to understand how a city could be a woman who was not yet born. And so she would puzzle and imagine until, little by little, the idea no longer seemed so strange. That's all for this week's episode. Stay up to date with upcoming episodes by subscribing at fallencycle.podbean.com or wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts. Check out the work of the contributing musicians. Those links and additional information is available in the text provided along with this episode. This audio edition was produced by James Curcio, along with text-to-speech synthesis. A statement on the use of LLMs is available on our website for those curious about how we do and don't use these technologies. This podcast is Creative Commons 3.0, attribution, share and share alike, non-commercial use.